I'd seen the Ledger of Souls less than 10 minutes ago before Jang Moo-yuk walked into the room, and now his presence was making it hard to breathe for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The air changed first. Conversations died mid-sentence. My father's security details straightened so fast their jackets strained against their holsters. Even the wedding planner, who had been frantically whispering into her headset, went pale and silent. Then he appeared in the doorway. He wore a tall black suit that moved like smoke, his face carved from something colder than marble. But it was the way he looked at the room that hit me first, like he was cataloging every person, every exit, and every potential threat in the span of a single breath. My heart slammed against my ribs, heat flooded my skin. I hated my body for the reaction, hated that I couldn't control it, but I kept my feet planted and my hands steady on the folder in front of me. His gaze swept the room and landed on me. It held. My throat went tight. Every instinct screamed to look away, to make myself smaller and invisible, the way I'd perfected over years of being my father's ghost employee. But I'd spent the last 30 seconds staring at the digital evidence of Seraphine's betrayal, at the $400 million theft that shouldn't exist, and something in me refused to flinch. Zanara Vale. His voice was low, controlled, and it landed somewhere below my stomach. Not a question, a confirmation. Yes. I was proud my voice didn't shake. He moved into the room. 2 men followed, silent, dangerous, flanking, but I couldn't look at them. Jang Moo-yuk took up all the available air. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that I could smell the rain on his coat and the danger radiating off his skin. You're aware of the terms. It wasn't a question either, but I answered anyway. I am now. The heavy platinum ring felt like a shackle as it slid onto my finger, a cold weight that seemed to anchor me to the marble floor of the cathedral vestry. Outside, the bells began to toll with a rhythmic finality, but inside this room, the only sound was the jagged breath of my father, the senator, as he slumped in a chair like a man whose soul had been traded for a few more months of political life. I stood there in a gown of pristine white silk, a color meant for brides, but today it felt more like the shroud of a target. I was the sacrificial lamb, a piece of collateral offered to appease the Yang Syndicate after Seraphine had vanished into the night with their liquid assets and their secrets. Jang Moo-hyuk moved toward me, his presence a dark tide that threatened to pull the very air from my lungs. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like an executioner who had just been handed his blade. The serpentine tattoos on his neck shifted with every lethal, measured step he took, a visual reminder that I was now the property of the silencer. He stopped just inches away, his shadow falling over me, obliterating the weak Georgetown sun that filtered through the stained glass windows. "The ceremony will be brief," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt in my marrow. "My people do not value spectacle, they value results." I tilted my head back to meet his gaze, my hand steady only through a sheer, disparate force of will. "Then we have that in common," I replied, my voice sounding more clinical than I felt. "I've spent 26 years as a fixer. I know how to deliver results, even when the contract is written in blood." Something flickered in his dark amber eyes, not the pity I expected, but a sharp, predatory interest. He reached out, his calloused thumb grazing my jawline, a touch that was both a promise and a threat. I was the illegitimate daughter, the ghost who had been absorbed like a stain into the Chase family, and now I was being wiped away to pay for their crimes. My father wouldn't even look at me. He was already calculating the survival of his presidential run, treating my life like a rounding error in his ledger. "Welcome to the family, Zanara," Moo-hyuk said, his smile slow and entirely satisfied as he guided me toward the side exit, away from the life I knew and into a fortress designed to keep the world out. As the heavy steel door clicked shut behind us, I realized the life of a ghost employee was over. I was stepping into a war, and though I wore the white of a victim, the fire Seraphine had started was already beginning to burn in my chest. The black SUV moved through the city like a predatory shadow, its windows so heavily tinted that the world outside looked like it was drowning in a gray underwater haze. Beside me, Jang Moo-huk remained a statue of dark silk and cold intent, his focus locked on a decrypted tablet, his silence more suffocating than any threat. We didn't head for the glass towers of Manhattan or a penthouse with a view. Instead, we drifted toward the Hudson waterfront, into a neighborhood forgotten by time and light. The iron hold loomed out of the salt-thick air, a converted pre-war armory that looked less like a home and more like a defensive position designed to withstand a siege. It was a fortress of brutal, oppressive mass, all thick concrete walls and industrial steel beams. As Moo-huk placed his palm against a biometric scanner, the locks disengaged with a sound like bones breaking, echoing through the cavernous, windowless hall. "This is your reality now," he said, his voice clipping the edges of the 30-foot ceilings as he led me through a maze of corridors that grew narrower and darker with every turn. Inside, everything was gray, black, and frigid. It felt like a bunker or perhaps a tomb, but as I walked, my heels clicking against the polished concrete, a strange sense of familiarity settled over me. For 26 years, I had lived in the Georgetown basement, a ghost employee scrubbing the digital sins of a senator who refused to acknowledge my existence. I had been trained for this silence. I had been forged in the dark corners of power where no one looked and no one cared. My father thought he was discarding a liability, but as I surveyed the high-tech security arrays and the silent enforcers flanking the halls, I realized he had actually handed me a master key. Moo-huk stopped at a heavy steel door and pushed it open to reveal a massive, sparse room dominated by a king-sized bed with dark industrial sheets. He moved to a wardrobe, his serpentine tattoos catching the harsh overhead light as he pulled out a small black case. "Your phone," he demanded, locking it away with a biometric seal before handing me the syndicate tablet. "You don't leave without me. You don't speak to the senator. You use this to find your sister, or you become a liability I cannot keep." The threat hung in the stagnant air, but as he turned and the lock clicked shut behind him, the silence didn't frighten me. In the absence of my family's constant lying noise, a different kind of clarity began to emerge. I sat on the edge of the bed, the concrete walls pressing in, and felt a strange, divine stillness. My father had made me invisible so I wouldn't be a scandal, but God had used that invisibility as a training ground. I was a ghost who knew how to haunt the very systems that tried to bury me. As I opened the tablet and began to bypass the first layer of encryption, I realized that while Moo-huk owned the iron hold, he didn't own the truth. The silence was no longer a cage. It was the frequency where I would finally hear the path to my own restoration. The dining hall of the iron hold was a cavern of industrial steel and flickering shadows, where the air smelled of gun oil and expensive whiskey. Moo-huk sat at the head of a table long enough to host a war council, his black suit blending into the darkness, making him appear like a shadow with a face of cold marble. I sat across from him, the white silk of my dress a blinding contrast to the gray concrete floors that echoed with every shift of my weight. A meal had been placed between us, but it felt less like sustenance and more like a test. Moo-huk didn't eat. He watched me with dark amber eyes that seemed to weigh my soul against my father's debts. "Your father called 3 times tonight," he said, his voice a low, clinical vibration. "He's worried you'll find the accounts Seraphine missed before he can liquidate them. He asked if I'd disciplined his ghost daughter yet for being slow." He leaned forward, the serpentine tattoos on his neck shifting in the dim light like a warning. He treats you like a broken tool, Zanara. Why are you sitting there with the posture of a queen when you know you were sold for the price of a scandal? The cruelty in his words was meant to draw blood, to make me flinch or lash out in the resentment I had perfected for 26 years. I felt the familiar heat of shame prickle my skin, but then I remembered the stillness I had found in the concrete silence of my room. I picked up my glass, my hand steady, and met his gaze with a peace that felt like a shield. My father sees merchandise because he is a merchant of people, Myuyuk, I said softly, my voice level and calm. But you're trying so hard to be the monster he described, yet you're the only person in 10 years who has actually looked me in the eye. I don't need to be disciplined. I need to be seen. And I forgive you for thinking you can ruin what you didn't create. Myuyuk froze. The predatory smile he usually wore faltered, leaving his face unmasked and strangely vulnerable. In the world of the Yan Syndicate, silence was a weapon and mercy was a weakness, but my refusal to return his venom seemed to strike him harder than any blade. He stared at me, his jaw tightening as he struggled to reconcile my dignity with the liability he thought he had purchased. The air in the room didn't just change, it shattered. For the first time, the silencer was the one who was quiet, his own heart becoming a battlefield he wasn't prepared to fight. The cold blue light of the syndicate tablet washed over my face, cutting through the perpetual shadows of the master bedroom. Outside, the Hudson River lapped against the concrete foundation of the iron hold, a rhythmic, mournful sound that mirrored the heavy silence of the fortress. Myuyuk had left me hours ago to handle the fallout of Seraphine's mess, leaving me alone with the digital ghosts of my past. He wanted me to find the $400 million to track the flight patterns of the sister who had traded my life for her own. But as I navigated the layered security protocols of my father's private server, I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for the truth that lived in the margins of his official business. I had been his fixer for 8 years, the invisible hand that scrubbed the stains from his presidential campaign. I knew his logic. I knew the way he hid his greatest sins behind the names of things he loved. When I finally reached the deepest partition, I found a file protected by an encryption algorithm that shouldn't have existed, a code based on my mother's maiden name spelled backward. My breath hitched. It was a ledger, but not one of donor contributions or offshore accounts. It was a spreadsheet, clinical and methodical, where each row represented a transaction of flesh and bone. I scrolled through the names, the least of these who had been bartered away like inventory, journalists who had asked too many questions, politicians' daughters who had become inconveniences, refugees promised a new life and delivered to the dark instead. Each entry had a status: fulfilled. The word tasted like ash. My father hadn't just built an empire on lies. He had built it on the bodies of the vulnerable, and he had done it with the same detached efficiency he used to order lunch. Then I reached the bottom. My own name stared back at me, Sophie Amara Chase. The delivery instructions were detailed, written in the same dry inventory management prose as the others. I was to be handed over to the Viper cartel post-election, a gift to secure unlimited campaign funding. My high-value skill set was noted as a reason for premium pricing. The fire didn't start as a roar. It began as a single searing spark of holy conviction in the center of my chest. For 26 years, I had believed I was invisible because I was worthless, a stain to be managed. Now I saw that I was only invisible because the darkness couldn't stand the light I was meant to carry. My father had appraised me like livestock, but in that moment, the ghost employee died. A new purpose, colder and sharper than any mafia blade, settled into my bones. I wasn't just going to find Seraphine. I was going to find every name on this list. I was going to be the scandal that didn't just ruin a senator, but dismantled the entire kingdom he had built on the suffering of the innocent. The sacrificial lamb was gone. The reckoning had begun.
The smell of sulfur and cordite hit me before I even saw the blood. I had followed the tracker on Muhik's tablet to a derelict textile factory in Queens, a place that felt like a trap even before the first gunshot shattered the heavy silence. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of pulverized concrete and the screams of dying machinery. I found them pinned behind a rusted industrial boiler. Muhik, his face a mask of cold fury, and Rook Jin, the enforcer who usually moved like a shadow, now slumped against a pillar with blood blooming through his black tuxedo. They were outgunned, the Viper mercenaries closing in with a coordinated efficiency that suggested they knew exactly who they were hunting. I felt the weight of the Glock in my hand, the weapon Muhik had forced me to master. Every survival instinct I'd honed as a ghost employee told me to stay in the darkness, to let the cycle of violence consume the man who had bought me. But as I looked at Muhik, I didn't see a warlord. I saw the man who had burned Chinatown for a drop of antidote, the man who carried my mother's promise in the serpentine ink on his skin. I didn't fire to kill. I fired at the overhead steam pipes, the pressurized hiss creating a blinding white curtain between the enforcers and their targets. In the chaos, I lunged forward, not for a weapon, but for the medical kit I'd stolen from the Ironhold's infirmary. "What are you doing?" Muhik roared, his voice rough with the smoke of the breach. "Get out of here, Zanara! Run!" "I'm not running," I said, my voice steady with a peace that didn't belong in a killing field. I knelt in the open, my white dress soaking up the grime of the factory floor as I pressed my hands against Rook Jin's wound. I could have pulled the trigger. I could have ended the men who stood in the way of my father's ledger. Instead, I chose to heal. I introduced a foreign concept into their world of eye for an eye, the radical, shattering weight of mercy. As I packed the wound, Muhik stared at me, his finger frozen on the trigger of his own weapon. The silencer was silenced by an act of grace he couldn't quantify. In that moment, the factory didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a sanctuary where the light I carried was finally starting to bleed into his darkness. The master bedroom was swallowed in a deep midnight blue. The only light emanating from the syndicate tablet where the ledger of souls remained open. I wasn't searching for encryption keys or routing numbers anymore. I was staring at the names, each one a person created for a purpose, now reduced to a line item in my father's clinical spreadsheet. I bowed my head, my forehead resting against the cold glass of the screen, and I began to speak their names into the silence of the Ironhold. I prayed for the journalists sold into silence, for the daughters traded for campaign funds, and for the man whose shadow was currently lengthening across the threshold of the door. Muhik stood in the doorway, his tall black suit disheveled from the factory raid, the serpentine tattoos on his neck dark against his pale skin. He didn't move. He watched me as I whispered for the restoration of the broken and for the heart of the man who thought he was my master. In the world of the Yan Syndicate, power was measured in the weight of a gun or the size of a bribe, but as he listened to my quiet intercession, I saw his shoulders drop with a heaviness that no armor could protect. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough and stripped of its usual clinical control. "They're names on a screen, Zanara. They're ghosts of a system that has already consumed them. Why speak to a god who let your father write this list in the first place?" I looked up, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in my eyes. "I am speaking to the only power that can rewrite it," I said softly.
My father thinks he owns these souls, and you think you own this fortress. But both of you are just men standing in the dark, terrified of the day the light finally breaks through." He stepped closer, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed the edge of the bed. For 10 years he had operated from the shadows, dismantling my father's network through violence, believing that blood was the only currency that mattered. But watching me pray for his enemies and for him triggered a collapse he couldn't stop. His eyes, usually gold and predatory, went dark with a sudden, agonizing realization. The power he had spent a lifetime building felt like ash in his mouth. He wasn't a king, he was a captive of his own vengeance, and for the first time, the silencer looked like a man who was desperate to be heard by something greater than his own fear. The heavy steel door of the master bedroom stood open, a literal invitation to the world beyond the concrete walls of the iron hold. Myuk stood by the narrow slit window, his back to me, the morning sun cutting across his broad shoulders in harsh golden blades. He had struck off his jacket, and the serpentine ink on his skin seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heavy, unsettled breathing. "The gate is open, Zenara," he said, his voice stripped of its clinical edge and replaced with a raw, jagged honesty. "No guards, no biometric locks between here and the street. I bought you to save you from the senator, but I realize now that I only traded one cage for another." He turned to face me, his dark amber eyes searching mine with a vulnerability that made my pulse spike. "You are not merchandise. You are not a liability. You are free. Take the accounts I've set up for you and disappear. Go where the shadows of your father can never find you." I looked at the open door, at the path to the life I had always thought I wanted, a life where I could finally be invisible on my own terms. But then I looked at the tablet resting on the bed, its screen still glowing with the names of the least of these from the Ledger of Souls. If I ran, I would be free, but they would remain in the dark. If I ran, Myuk would return to a life of cold vengeance, a man consumed by the very darkness he tried to fight. I walked toward him, not with the hesitant steps of a captive, but with the steady grace of a woman who had finally found her ground. I reached out and closed the heavy steel door, the lock clicking into place with a sound that felt like a covenant. "I'm not running, Myuk," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. "My father spent 26 years making me a ghost so I would be easy to sell. If I leave now, he wins." I stepped into his space, looking up at the man who had carried my name over his heart for a decade. "I'm staying, not because of the contract and not as your property. I'm staying as your partner. We are going to use your steel and my light to burn his ledger to the ground." His breath hitched, his hand moving to cup my face with a reverence that felt like a prayer. In the silence of the fortress, the silencer finally found a reason to speak. "Then we burn it together," he whispered. The ballroom of the Victory Gala was a cathedral of excess, dripping in gold chandeliers and the false laughter of 500 guests who believed they were witnessing the birth of a presidency. My father stood at the podium, a man of curated patriotism, soaking in the applause of donors, while the golden child, Seraphine, watched from the front row in crimson silk. They thought they had won. They thought the ghost daughter was still tucked away in a concrete tomb, a liability successfully managed. I entered the room on Myuk's arm, the white of my dress catching the light like a flare. We didn't move with the desperation of fugitives, but with the synchronized precision of a reckoning. Myuk's presence, the tall black suit and the serpentine tattoos peeking above his collar, sent a ripple of silence through the crowd as we approached the stage. My father's face went the color of wet concrete, his hand pressing to his chest as his heart began to fail him at the sight of us. "Sophie!"
he wheezed, his voice cracking through the sudden quiet of the ballroom. "What is this?" "It's the truth, Papa," I said, my voice steady and clear, reaching the cameras that were broadcasting this victory to the nation. Instead of the gunfire my father expected, the mafia bloodbath he had likely prepared for, the massive campaign screens behind him suddenly flickered and died. Then the ledger of souls appeared. Line by line, name by name, the clinical spreadsheet of my father's sins was projected for the world to see. The names I had prayed over in the darkness were now illuminated in blinding white light. 53 entries of human lives traded for campaign funds and debt forgiveness. Seraphine lunged for her clutch, her face a mask of desperate terror, but Muyuk shifted fractionally, his mere shadow enough to freeze her in place. The room erupted, not with bullets, but with the chaotic roar of a scandal that could never be fixed. My father stared at the screens, watching his own execution in digital ink. I stood in the center of the storm, my hand locked in Muyuk's, realizing that the greatest weapon we possessed wasn't the steel in his holster, but the truth that was finally setting us and every name on that list free. The hidden things had been brought into the light, and the dark kingdom was finally beginning to burn. The sirens wailed in the distance, a mourning song for the empire we had just dismantled. But inside the quiet sanctuary of the Ironhold's private office, the only sound was the crackle of a dying fire. Muyuk stood before the hearth, his tall black suit jacket discarded, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal the serpentine ink that had defined his life as a warlord. In his hands, he held the thick, leather-bound folder of syndicate contracts, the physical evidence of a decade spent in the shadows of vengeance. "The silencer died in that ballroom tonight, Zana'a," he said, his voice a rough whisper that lacked its usual clinical edge. He looked at the documents, then at me, his dark amber eyes reflecting a deep internal collapse. I spent years thinking I could use the darkness to fight the dark. I thought these names, these debts were my power, but they were just another ledger of souls. He took a single contract, the one my father had signed to sell me, and held it over the flames. As the edges curled and blackened, I stepped closer, my hand finding the small of his back, feeling the tension finally bleed out of his frame. "Repentance isn't just saying you're sorry, Muyuk," I murmured, watching the paper turn to ash. "It's choosing a new direction. It's letting the old man die so the new one can breathe." One by one, he fed the syndicate ties into the fire, the debts of his rivals, the shipping manifests for the trafficking routes Seraphine had corrupted, and the blueprints of the fortresses he'd conquered. All of it became smoke and embers. He wasn't just burning paperwork, he was burning the shackle of his past. The predatory stillness that had always defined him shifted into a grounded peace. "I made a promise to your mother to protect you," he said, turning to face me as the last contract vanished into the heat. "I thought that meant keeping you safe in a cage. Now I see it means standing beside you in the light." He reached out, his thumb tracing the characters of my name tattooed over his heart, the only mark of his old life he chose to keep. The silencer was gone, his identity as a criminal kingpin consumed by the same holy fire that had exposed my father. In the cooling gray ash of the fireplace lay the remains of a monster, and in the silence that followed, a partner finally stood where a master had been. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the high arched windows of my new office, not a basement bunker, but a seat of influence that overlooked the Capitol. I sat at a mahogany desk reviewing the first quarterly reports of the Restoration Initiative, a private foundation built from the liquid assets Seraphine had tried to steal and the syndicate wealth Muyuk had liquidated before his death. We weren't fixing scandals anymore. We were funding safe houses, providing legal shields for the vulnerable, and systematically dismantling the trafficking routes that had once been my father's ledger of souls. The private side door opened with a silent efficiency I had come to know as well as my own heartbeat. Jang Moo-hyuk walked in, officially a ghost to the world, but more alive than I had ever seen him. He had traded his tall black suit for something less like armor and more like the partner he had become. He crossed the room with that familiar predatory grace, but his eyes, once colder than marble, now held a warmth that felt like home. "The final shipment of medical supplies arrived at the border clinic," he said, sitting on the edge of my desk and scattering the appropriations files. "The victims from the Viper cartel list are all accounted for. They're safe, Zanara. They're being seen." I leaned back, a sense of profound, divine restoration settling into my bones. My father had wanted a warranty against his own loss, and in his greed, he had created a queen who knew exactly how to burn his world down. But I hadn't just survived the fire, I had been refined by it. Beside me, Moo-hyuk reached out, his hand cupping my chin to tilt my face toward his. The serpentine tattoos on his neck remained, a permanent reminder of the darkness we had walked through to find this light. "You're magnificent," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a reverence that still made my pulse spike. "We are," I corrected softly, threading my fingers through his. We had forged a dynasty from the ashes of two broken kingdoms, a dynasty not of blood and fear, but of grace and protection. Power was no longer a cage or a commodity, it was a tool for the broken. As he leaned in to claim a kiss that tasted of victory and peace, I realized that the ghost daughter and the silencer had finally found their true names. We were the guardians of the shadows, and our work was only just beginning.